The 1967 Continental was certainly a stately luxury car, and this was getting toward the end of the run for this particular generation unibody Continental. That's right, this actually was a unibody car that was built in Ford's Wixom, Michigan plant. And for those who don't know, the 58 to 1960 Continental that preceded it was also a unibody vehicle along with the Thunderbird, all of which were built at Ford's Wixom assembly plant in Michigan. But for 1967, the Continental was kind of nearing the end of its run, I should say, close to it. This particular generation would last from 1961 all the way through to 1969. In 1970, an all-new Continental would be released to the public, and that one would be a body-on-frame Continental. So Ford would kind of go back to its typical construction, in addition to capitalizing on some new styling trends, but really staying true to the original Continental's Continental roof styling on that vehicle, and something that would be a part of Lincoln styling for some time. By the way, for those who don't know what I mean by the Continental-style roof, take a look at this particular photo where you can see how far inside the door glass is from the outer side edge of the door. There's this shoulder that runs in between that side glass and the outer edge of the door, and that was something that was characteristic of the Continental and Lincolns, even cars like the Mark III, for instance, for a number of years. It started going away with the Mark IV a little bit, but this was, again, a trend in Ford design for many years, and it all began with that seminal 1961 Continental. Now, by 1967, that original 1961 Continental had undergone a number of revisions. There were some, of course, styling revisions that were happening, minor ones every year, but there was a big tweak by this point, and the Continental was now on a longer 126-inch wheelbase. And that particular wheelbase was introduced for the 1964 model year and would carry through 1969. The original wheelbase of the Continentals was 123 inches from 1961 through 1963. That was expanded in 1964 to give backseat passengers a little bit more legroom, and it was needed because, well, people who were driving luxury cars expected true six-passenger comfort during this time frame. In the original 1961 to 63 variant, it was a little tight back there. So the car got longer in 1964 through the end of the run, and kind of every couple of years thereafter, while the car didn't add wheelbase, it did add overall length to the point that it was almost 225 inches long by the time that 1969 rolled around. And that was almost a foot longer than the car was when it started production in 1961. 67 is kind of this intermediate year where there was a major styling refresh for 1966, and there were some new mechanicals as well. Under hood, the 462 cubic inch MEL V8 would replace the 430 cubic inch MEL V8 that had powered Continentals since the 1958 model year. The engine had a bore of 4.38 inches and a stroke of about 3.8 inches, so it was an over-square design where the bore was greater than the stroke. And it made 340 horsepower, had hydraulic lifters, was topped by a Carter AFB or aluminum 4-barrel carburetor throughout its run. This is actually the largest production V8 that Ford would put in a vehicle. Many people forget about this 462 cubic inch V8 and assume that the 460 that would precede it, that would be introduced partway through the 1968 model year, is actually the largest gasoline Ford V8 engine that would go in a passenger car. That is not true. The 462, I think, gets forgotten because it was introduced for the 1966 model year, and it lasted only partway through the 1968 model year, where it would be superseded, as I mentioned, by that 385 series 460 cubic inch V8. Ford did produce larger gasoline V8 engines, but those really went in Super Duty trucks. We'll save that for another video. They had some that were over 500 cubic inches for those who aren't aware. Those are some pretty awesome engines, but again, we'll save that for another video. So you had the 462 under hood, you had a C6 transmission, you had heavy-duty, let's say, mechanical components associated with the 1967 Continental, and you had some kind of cool and funky equipment during that particular time frame associated with this car. But one of the things that I wanted to say about the 1967 Continental is it has a beautifully integrated option that I don't think has been so well integrated ever before or since, at least on the Ford side. I guess one could say that in later years it was better done, but certainly not at this point. Now, one of the things that was popular in this particular time frame, and even before, was the automatic headlamp dimming. And this was something that Cadillac had and some General Motors cars, as well as optional equipment on Fords. It wasn't just a Lincoln piece of optional equipment. You could get it on other Ford vehicles as well. And it went by different names. Some called it Guidematic, some called it different things. But in any case, automatic headlamp dimming was something that was optional on many upper-end cars during this time frame. And oftentimes the way that Ford executed this particular option was by putting this little unit on the driver's side fender that would protrude. And, of course, then that would sense the oncoming vehicle lights and dim your headlights appropriately when it sensed that those oncoming vehicle headlights were hitting that light sensor. And it kind of looked a little cool and funky having it on the driver's side fender. It was not entirely clear what it was. It looked like a little periscope almost, and I guess to some degree it kind of was. But this was how Ford often did it on many vehicles. You can see it here as a option on my 68 Park Lane Brougham. I believe this was a dealer-only option at the time. And you can see it also on my 1969 Mark III. So that was the standard way that Ford executed this particular piece of content. But on the 1967 Continental, as you're going to see in this particular brochure for the 67 Continental, Ford had a different idea with respect to how it would execute this option. More specifically, as opposed to placing something externally like you saw on the Mark III and my Park Lane Brougham, or internally, like you would see on the previous generation Continentals, kind of this big bubble periscope thing on the dash. Now Ford decided to beautifully integrate that option and the light sensor into the driver's side kind of blade of the fender. So instead of having this wraparound piece of stainless that would go down the crisp edge of the fender, the leading edge of the fender, you had that stainless was broken by the sensor that you can see there. And, well, nobody really ever knew necessarily what that was for. It just kind of blended seamlessly into the overall styling of the car. And I think this is especially cool. And, it's something that is a great trait of these 67 Continentals. And it just goes to speak to how Ford engineers were really trying to do beautiful work and beautiful execution and keep their cars looking beautiful during this particular time frame. Now, this was obviously a great look for this particular design with respect to this sensor. I do have some concerns, I guess. One is that if the sensor got dirty, or let's say you were driving in the snow and snow would pile up on it, well, then it would become non-functional, as opposed to sensors that were mounted on the dash inside the car. Obviously, if snow were piling up on the windshield or something like that, you'd be running the windshield wipers, and so it would naturally clear it out of the way. But, of course, that cluttered the dashboard. And many car companies, Cadillac as an example included, would put that sensor somewhere up front. Cadillac often mounted it behind the grille. And, of course, you could get snow and road grime and dirt over top of the sensor covering it up so that would hamper its overall effectiveness. So let's just say that the practicality of placing the sensor up front and in a place where it could readily get dirty was something that was done with a lot of cars of the era. And it was just assumed that you would, as an owner, go wipe it off, basically, and clean it off so that it worked effectively. It's kind of like nowadays they have washer fluid bottles under hood that I think hold, 3 liters plus of fluid, or a gallon plus of fluid if you're in the U.S. And they just assume that nobody's ever going to pop the hood anymore. Back in this time frame, the washer bottles were relatively small because it was just assumed that an owner would pop the hood and refill the washer bottle. And it doesn't really happen much anymore. Most people just keep the hood closed for the entirety of the car's life and assume the dealer will service whatever is needed. So, in any case, that I thought was a beautiful piece of content that I wanted to highlight on the 67 Continentals. There are also some other funky things in terms of the design of these. The backwards windshield wipers that I think were just done for packaging reasons. Never really got a good answer as to why those were executed that way, but that's the only reason that I can surmise that they would do it that way. This clearly was not a car that was going to be dominating sales in right-hand drive markets, so that certainly isn't the reason. But another piece of interesting content on these is that they have a hydraulic wiper setup that's driven off of the power steering pump, not off of an accessory drive on the engine. So you can see these two lines that are running in through the firewall here, and those two lines are for the hydraulic wipers. There was a control on the dash that you would turn, and as opposed to having an intermittent wipe, these would be continuously variable speed. So they could wipe very slowly, they could wipe very quickly, and that was how Ford executed this. I thought that was a pretty interesting thought, as opposed to just having something wipe on an intermittent basis. Just have it wipe more slowly or more quickly, and you could have it be continuously variable speed. You didn't have to have 2-speed or 3-speed wipers. I think it was a good thought in practice, but my guess is it was pretty expensive. And it was also something that might have been less reliable because you are running hydraulic lines basically into the car. And hopefully one doesn't spring a leak because you're going to have transmission fluid, which was what was used in Ford power steering pumps at the time, all over the carpet and everything inside your vehicle. So just beware of that. But again, a cool feature of these. I mentioned they're driven off the power steering pump. For those who don't know, if you look under hood, you're not going to find a typical accessory drive power steering pump on these engines. The power steering pump is actually driven off the front end of the crankshaft. So if you see a little reservoir, it's literally just that. It's a reservoir. It is not the accessory drive power steering pump. And that worked for a number of years, and the MEL V8s had it all the way back to 1958. Even the next generation 385 series engines had that, like my Mark III, the 69 Mark III, has a power steering pump that's driven off of the front of the engine. And, amazingly, it works just fine. There's no issues. Mine has been very, very reliable. So it's an effective design and makes a lot of sense. Now, I have to say one thing is interesting about these two when it comes to mechanicals, and that is that these Continentals do have leaf springs in the rear, a la Chrysler. I guess Ford took a page out of Chrysler's book. They do have coil springs up front. They didn't have torsion bars like Chrysler's did. But interestingly, in 1958 and 59, the cars had 4-coil suspension, and then Ford went to leaf springs in the back in 1960, and that would continue all the way through on Continentals to the 1969 model year. The all-new Continental in 1970 would return back to 4-coil suspension in addition to full-frame construction. But I think Ford did that really for cost savings. Chrysler people will never admit that the leaf spring setup was something that was done for cost savings. But I think it really was. Leaf springs are generally cheaper than coil springs, and they do have some advantages. They don't deflect as much under load. The coil spring, it really has to take up a fair amount of slack before it starts exerting resistance. The leaf springs, that's not true. So often if you're towing, the leaf springs can be better. But I don't think a lot of people were necessarily towing with their Continentals, although many people did use their cars as tow vehicles during this particular time frame. SUVs were not all that popular. The term SUV hadn't even come out. And you could tow 5,000, 6,000, in the case of some vehicles, 7,000 pounds with your car. And they effectively were truck frames underneath a lot of these vehicles. But of course, the Continental, as I mentioned, was unibody, so there was not that heavy-duty frame underneath, although the unibody was indeed quite heavy-duty. And I don't know if Ford really ended up saving anything in weight. These cars were porkers when it came to the scale. They weighed close to 5,000 pounds. And I think that's because they had so many body flex issues, particularly with the previous generation Continental that had a longer wheelbase, 130 inches plus, that Ford really engineered these to be quite heavy duty. In any case, hope you enjoyed this little spotlight on the 67 Continental and some of its unique features. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Share with your friends. What I find is actually about 60% of you are not yet subscribed. What are you waiting for? Click that subscribe button so you're notified of all my future videos. Thanks again for watching.